8. We'll still try to get out at 5 o'clock on each of those days, but just warning. And then Wednesday, we're on the floor, and that's turnaround. So moving on for today, we are going to be having a hearing on a House Bill 2738. Before we open that hearing, Nick, could you provide an overview?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, committee. Committee, House Bill 2738 amends the statewide excess cost calculation formula and then does some other things with regard to special education state aid that I'll get into here in a sec. So starting with the special education excess costs formula, so current law requires the State Board of Education to calculate the statewide amount of school districts' excess costs for the provision of special education related services. So the statute currently is used to determine the amount of special education state aid that should be appropriated to school districts. So this statute generally provides that the amount of state aid that should be appropriated, it should be 92% of the excess costs. Generally, this formula is structured in a way that the KSDE and the statute takes the total special education expenditures of school districts, subtracts out the general education costs that are attributable to special education students, subtracts out federal funding and contracts with state institutions to arrive at the amount of costs that are in addition to general education costs, which is the excess costs. So these are generally those, as I said, the costs that are over and above the cost to provide a general education to students. So what Section 2 does is it amends this formula to count additional state and local funding within the excess cost calculation. So I've attached a memorandum, or attached to the memorandum, I've attached a chart that provides what the difference is and just kind of provides what the current formula is, the steps that you would use to determine excess costs under the current formula, and then the steps that you would use to determine excess costs under the new formula provided by House Bill 2738. I'm not going to get into that. Well, besides the fact that currently there are weightings that are subtracted out from the excess cost calculation. This new formula would essentially include those weightings within the math for determining the general education costs. So it would include at-risk, transportation, bilingual weightings within the general education costs when you're determining excess costs. In addition, this new formula would capture some local option budget monies within its calculation as well. So that's in Section 2 of the bill. So in Section 1 of the bill, this would be a new section of law. And what this section would do is it would require the State Department of Education and the State Board of Education to determine each individual school district's excess costs using that same calculation methodology that's provided in Section 1 for the statewide excess cost calculation. So KSD would be determining each individual school district's excess costs pursuant to statute. I think you guys all saw a chart that essentially provided how the current calculation methodology would be applied to individual school districts in determining individual school district excess costs. That's not currently required by statute. This would put that requirement into statute that you determine school district excess costs pursuant to this new calculation methodology. I will note that as part of this school district calculation, some of the issues we were dealing with when we were looking at it, the bill would provide that school districts who are part of an interlocal or cooperative arrangement, the state board is to assign associated costs based on the amount that each school district is paying for the interlocal or cooperative agreement. So it's essentially assigning costs to the districts to attribute those costs somewhere. So going back to Section 2 of the bill, Section 2 would also require the State Board of Education to establish a special education state aid equalization distribution schedule. and then to distribute certain amounts of special education state aid pursuant to this equalization distribution schedule. So this schedule would have to be developed by the state board pursuant to this bill, and it must be developed in a way that provides for a more equitable distribution of special education state aid based on discrepancies between school districts' individual excess costs that are determined pursuant to the excess cost calculation that I just discussed for each school district. So what this bill says is that the amount of special education state aid that's appropriated in excess of the amount that the legislature appropriated for fiscal year '24, which is $528 million, and you can see the exact dollar amount there. Any amount in excess of that amount that's appropriated for that year shall be distributed to school districts pursuant to that equalization distribution schedule. So the bill also does provide that that amount, that $528 million amount, would continue to be distributed to school districts pursuant to the normal, or not the normal, the statutory distribution schedule that's provided in current law, whereas any excess amount, again, would be distributed pursuant to the state board's, the equalization distribution schedule that the state board establishes pursuant to this bill. In addition, there's a reporting requirement in this bill. So when the state board and KSD is determining individual school district excess costs, they would be required to report those individual district excess costs and to publish those amounts on the State Department of Education's website. And then additionally, the KSDU would be required to provide a report to you all on this committee specifically, and then the Senate Education Committee on or before January 31 each year, that provides a breakdown of each individual school district's excess cost, and then also a breakdown of how the special education state aid was distributed pursuant to the new equalization distribution schedule that's established by the state board. Lastly, the bill would amend the local option budget statute, KSA 725143, to require that each school district's local option budget that's attributable to the special education weighting, the amount of aid that's attributable to the special education weighting that's raised by the local option budget, be transferred to that school district's special education fund. And Madam Chair and members of the committee, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
All right, thank you, Nick. Questions? Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excuse me. Got a couple. You know, when you talk about the equalization distribution schedule, and you said something about in an equitable format, can you explain what you said, what you meant by that again? I'm looking on page 6 of the bill.
Of the bill, yes, that's the correct location for this, the requirements for this equalization distribution schedule. Generally what you're reading here is what I'm going to tell you. So the purpose of this equalization distribution schedule is to provide for a more equitable distribution of special education state aid among school districts based on each school district's excess costs. So it would essentially be a way to distribute aid to the school districts that would have lower excess cost values as compared to other school districts that are receiving
So when you say
additional aid.
schedule, you're talking about a period of time in the, or what?
It would, essentially, this would be a methodology that the State Board of Education would come up with and adopt in order to distribute a certain amount of state aid above that $528 million amount to school districts based on an equitable manner based on each individual school district's excess costs.
Okay. So where does, and you've mentioned LOB just in this last kind of segment, but I keep reading, I mean, LOB jumps out 2 or 3 times. First, can you explain the current formula that would yield special ed funds? How does that work? LOB, those special aid funds that I can get from my LOB, how does that work currently?
I got you. So The local option budget is based on the total foundation aid of a school district. And you get a certain percentage
Right.
that you can levy as a tax, a mill levy, essentially maybe 31 or 33% of a school district's total foundation aid. Well, the way the special education weighting works is it's not actually an individual student weighting. It's essentially a formula way to determine a weighting amount that gets multiplied by the base aid. So essentially you're taking the amount of special education state aid you appropriate, divide by the base, and that's your weighting. Well, then you multiply that by the base again to get your total foundation aid. It goes into your total foundation aid, and that determines how much LOB authority a school district has to levy.
That's currently.
That's current.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, with this new formula, how does it work?
So that amount of money that's attributable, any amount of money that the school district is levying that's attributable to that special education weighting that gets multiplied to get total foundation aid within your local option budget would then have to be transferred over to the special education fund of the school district. So the school district would still be levying the same amount of local option budget by their choice to do so. But then that portion that's attributable to that special education weighting would then get moved and be required to be moved to the special education fund.
But I see LOB in here more than just that time.
So you're talking about the excess cost formula, the
Right.
calculation formula as well.
2738.
That formula, so that's separate probably from the, and I think part of probably some of the formula is trying to capture what's happening with the LOB transfer provision.
So you mentioned one time, when I computed, for lack of a better word, old formula, and I got that one figure. Now, keep me going. Where else do you address LOB? No place?
The bill within the excess cost formula, and you can see in that chart that I provided, you can see certain steps where it does include, for example, step 6 of this House Bill 2738 formula. You're multiplying essentially your general education dollar amount by the statewide average local option budget percentage.
I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. What page are you on?
So I'm looking at my chart on the memo, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And you can look in the bill as well, but there's multiple places throughout that formula where you're looking at and calculating LOB amounts.
Sorry, now, what did you say?
So on my chart on the memo, that might be the easiest place to look. You can see where the formula under House Bill 2738 would be factoring in local option budget percentages. So for example, step 6 includes that requirement. And then if you look on step 12 as well, there's part of the formula is capturing a portion of the LOB percentage.
So 2 places?
And then step 13,
times?
you're looking at supplemental state aid as well. So that's the state aid that would be provided for the local option budget.
So I've tapped or used the LOB computation 3 times?
It's all going to be in the math. I mean, this formula, the key with this formula, whether it's the current formula in statute or this formula right here, it's telling you, the legislature, essentially how much you need to appropriate. And that's it. There's nothing else to it. It's just how much you need to appropriate. And the legislature, you determine how much to appropriate, notwithstanding this formula. And that's why you hear the debate about 92% and stuff like that. So that, and you might just, some of the folks behind me might be able to explain some of the thinking behind what the calculation is and the purpose of these calculations within this formula.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I may have a few more questions later. Thank you.
Sure, and I'm going to piggyback on this before Representative Hill goes, because I think it is confusing, but just remember, there's the calculation side and there's the distribution side. The first question you asked was on the distribution side. For that, the LOB is calculated the same way that it is today. You're getting 33%, 31 to 33% for the average district for your special education. So if you had $1 million in your school district, for state aid for special education, then you could get up to 33% of that. So that might be $330,000 that came into your supplemental aid, local, right? So this doesn't change that. It just says that that amount of money is now counted. The parallel to kind of help you process what's going on here, the parallel is, think about at risk. At risk, we spend $750 million a year on at risk, and 171 million of it is in LOB. So we make our districts take the full at risk, whether it's in the foundation aid portion, the general fund portion, or if it's in the LOB, and we say all of it must go for at risk. The same is true for English language learners. We say you must take the supplemental portion as well and put it in your at risk. The only one that we don't do that for is special education. And truly that was an instance, and if you remember back in our interim, when we asked Craig why, and he said, good question. You know, he didn't have, I mean, it's just a legislative choice. The other side, when you were noticing LOB, please let me know if I'm wrong, Nick, on the calculation side, the first step was always taking the supplemental general and adding it with the general. That was always the first step. It looks differently on the right-hand side, but in all actuality, it's doing the same thing, correct, Nick? The first step?
I'd have to get a little bit more time to do the math. And I want to listen too to some of the folks who are on this calculation a little bit. Because it is different, and I hesitate to speak on whether it's the same or not, Madam Chair.
Okay, the intent is to take that amount of money that we're spending for our students and have that same starting place, but in this bill, there is the removal of 4, or actually the addition back of 4 of the weightings. Because in the original calculation, we said if you want to know what the average cost it is to have a student attend school, well, it's not going to be the average cost. We're going to take out at risk. That's not going to be part of your average cost. We're going to take out transportation. That's not going to be a part of the cost. And they take out 5 different things. In this bill, in this version, only one thing is taken out, and that's special education. Because the goal of either the existing law or this one is to understand what's the average cost to educate a regular general education student. And the way that so that kind of gives you an idea of what that's setting up. So I hope that just helps a tiny, tiny bit. Representative Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Nick, for the explanation on this. I had one question. When you talked about, go back to the interlocals and the co-ops, and the amount attributed to the districts is going to be the amount they paid in. Is that what you said? Am I saying that correctly?
That's the way it should work. I mean, that language is in current statute with regard to distributing special education state aid and attributing costs to interlocals and co-ops. So this language is the same language from current statute to attribute costs to each district that are part of those interlocals and cooperatives.
So am I correct in that federal dollars go directly to the interlocal and the co-op? They do not go to the district?
That we probably need to get an answer on from KSDE, or have them describe exactly where that money flows, those federal dollars flow to, and where the expenditure looks like it's made from.
Okay, because that's my understanding is that it's weird with the challenge with some of our printouts we've had is that the federal dollars are not attributed because they are distributed through the interlocals and co-ops. Am I correct on that?
I mean, so the charts you were looking at were individual district excess cost calculation. And as I said, this current law doesn't require an individual district excess cost calculation. So all the federal dollars in the statewide excess cost calculation are there. And then once you start doing the individual district excess costs, I think you notice some of the issues with accounting for those federal funds and dollars per district. And the bill is attempting to capture that and attribute those costs to each district based on the costs they're paying in.
Okay, we might have to look at that a little bit to see how those are attributed, because it's my understanding to go to the co-op and interlocal and they're used there, and they never actually go through the district's accounts. Okay, thank you.
Nick, hold on 1 minute. Does anybody else have a question for Nick? Because if not, I'm going to ask a question of Jennifer related to the math. Representative McDonald? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I may have more questions for Nick as time goes by. I'm kind of new, and I got a little stuck here. It's my understanding that this bill might freeze funding at like the 2024 amount. Is that accurate? Surely not.
So that 2024 state aid amount, the $528 million, would continue to be distributed pursuant to the statutory distribution methodology, essentially transportation, special teacher entitlement. Anything above that, above and beyond that in subsequent years would be distributed pursuant to that State Board of Education equalization distribution methodology.
Representative Poskin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So local option budget is going to be included in this formula, and those are dollars that are purely local funding, local tax dollars, but it's going to be credited towards the state share of the 92% of excess cost?
I believe that this formula will capture some of those local option budget money, so I believe you are correct.
Thank you.
Also to note, Representative, the state equalizes that. So there is a state supplemental state aid, and then there's a local. But either way, for at-risk students and ELL, all of it, local and state, must be put in the fund. And this is paralleling it to existing statute. Those dollars do not exist without special education students, so they are attributable to it. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you a question because, Nick, you weren't sure how this bared itself out, and I'm actually using Nick's sheet right here and just comparing the first 2 or 3 steps. The first step on the left says determine total general fund and local option budget. So that's basically your foundation aid, which is your base times your weighting. Would that be what that is?
Madam Chair, that would be the total foundation aid, not state foundation aid.
So that would be all of your funds, but it would include your base times your weightings.
Yes.
Okay. And the state foundation aid would just be the base times the weighting.
Yes, because the state foundation aid is base times the weightings minus the
Federal and local.
federal and local. So total foundation aid includes federal, local, and state.
Okay, and it'd be more like local grants, things like that.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, because obviously it wouldn't be local property tax because that would be included for the LOB. Yes. Okay, so if we go over to the right-hand side, it says determine the weighted FTE enrollment. So we have, what, maybe 460,000 heads or individual bodies? And we probably have, what, 650,000 weighted FTE. I'm trying to help our committee understand what this means. Because remember, committee, that every time you have a weighting, you're multiplying it by a person. So for example, the at-risk is 0.484. So if you have one student, that's 1. If they have an at-risk weighting, they are now 1.4 484. If they receive transportation, if they are the English language learners, a variety of other things, then you keep adding that up. If you are or a low enrollment school, then maybe every one of your students is worth 2 students. So you have a weighted FTE and you have an actual head count. What this does in this first line, it says determine the weighted FTE enrollment. So that would probably be 670.
Somewhere around there.
So
That's,
we'll just throw that out as a estimate, 670,000, and then that's the weighted, and then you multiply that by that CPIU 3-year average growing base, which is now 5,088. So what it does there is it looks to me as if they're doing the same thing, they just have a different starting place. And I do think that, Nick, you're right, we have to make sure that they are in fact doing the same thing. Did you want to comment?
So total foundation aid is essentially your base times your weightings. And then your state foundation aid is you subtract out your local aid and you would get your state foundation aid. But total foundation aid is base times weighting. So the step 1 includes the total general fund and then local option budgets of all school districts under the current calculation. Whereas the step 1 on this is only looking at weighted FTE enrollment.
Right, but your step 2 then multiplies it by the base. If you take step 1 and 2 on the right, does that then equal the number 1 on the left?
I don't believe so with the local option budget calculation, but I think that comes in later. And again, that's why I hesitate to speak too much on the math of it because I just need to see numbers, possibly get a run on it type of thing, see what the agency says.
Okay, and in terms of any of the math, if the math needs to be worked out, squared away, it certainly can. But the intent is for basically it be the same, but it's just removing some of those weightings. But we won't get into all those nitty-gritty details at the moment. Representative Owsley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Nick, I think you kind of touched on this. I'm looking at the fiscal note, and you mentioned the 528 and then the remaining 7.5. But the paragraph above that on the last page says, from the governor's FY25 recommendations for special education, state aid, the enactment of this bill would result in a reduction of approximately $82.4 million to school districts. And is that the run you're talking about looking at is reducing that 82.4, or is that the kind of freeze that Representative McDonald was talking about, and that we just don't do anything financially with special education state aid?
I need to look at the fiscal note because I'm not aware of the $82 million they're referencing, unless that was they're going off the governor's recommended amount. And if they're going off of that amount, this bill doesn't do anything with regard to the appropriations for special education state aid. So as you referenced, I think their fiscal year 25 appropriation for special education state aid has already been made in Senate Bill 113, and it includes an additional $7.5 million above the $528 million. So that would be essentially under this bill distributed pursuant to this equalization methodology. Any additional amounts that are recommended by the legislature or the governor and then appropriated by the legislature on top of that also would be distributed pursuant to this methodology as well.
I'm gonna chew on that for a second, because this does say from the governor's FY25 recommendations, which I believe followed the state board's plan to bring us into 92% of excess cost within 5 years. I don't have that in front of me. I will find it. I'll come back to this. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think that this does nothing financially for our school districts.
I think the state board's was higher, but it was over 4 years, and the governor's is less, over 5 years. But you're correct that the fiscal note is based on, or is treating this as an appropriations bill. This is a bill that corrects the statute, starts us from our starting point of 528, which was last year, and gives the parameters for the distribution of all future increases. So with that in mind, then of course there's intent for future increases. But since we combine everything together, that would be in our appropriations portion. So the legislature has increased special education funding every single year for those that are new. Representative McDonald, like you mentioned that every meeting. So we put in 44.5 million the very first year of Gannon, and then 7.5, and all of those years were known and commented on by the Kansas Supreme Court and fulfilling our obligation. So if there aren't any more questions for Nick, then we'll go ahead and open our hearing. Thank you, Nick, and I'm sure there will be future questions. All right, committee. And then again, thank you, Jennifer, for providing some excess costs. She's got it right here. She'll show you. Thank you very much. That should be very helpful. That is, of course, total excess costs, and we look at those calculations every year. All right, so we'll officially open the hearing for House Bill 2738, and we will start with Dave Traubert from Kansas Policy Institute. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Dave Traubert, CEO of Kansas Policy Institute. We're pleased to provide testimony in support of this bill so that, and as was said earlier, this is not an appropriations bill. This has no bearing on what the legislature chooses to spend on special education. It describes a formula that lays out how the state's obligation would be calculated, how excess costs and so forth would be calculated. As you heard, some of the weightings are not included in the current formula, even though special ed students are eligible for those weightings. It also, the current formula counts the LOB that is related to general education of special ed students, but not the rest of LOB. And multiple times, the Department of Education has been asked to comment on this, and I've been in the room when they've said, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, those of you who have been around for a while know that periodically there's trailer bills to fix unintended errors in legislation, and this appears to be one. I say that because we asked the Special Education Task Force to, if they were going to keep the formula, to please identify any rational basis for excluding certain weightings, for counting some LOB, but not none. Unfortunately, the majority of the members of the Special Ed Task Force chose not to examine anything. They just went ahead and recommended spending more money. So absent any rational basis for excluding, we contend that the formula is flawed and it should be adjusted to count everything. Now, what I've tried to do in my testimony, because I think this is easier to look with numbers side by side, so there's a table in a couple of tables in my testimony that I'll be referencing here. This starts with the statutory reference that's, the last designation is capital letter A. It identifies the weighted students in the legal max. This is calculating general education the same way that it's using the Department of Education's legal max file that they publish every year. So it starts with weighted students that don't count SPED. And for this is all shown as if this formula had been in place for 2023. So the first number would be 673,271 students. You multiply that times the base aid. It was 4,846 in 2023, and then in B, that would result in about 3.3 billion in general education aid provided for all students. And you divide that by the number of actual FTE students, and in Section C, it would result in $7,017 per student that's provided for general education. Then you multiply that in Section D, or Section D is 28,947. And this is all KSDE data. That's the full-time equivalent of special ed students. So you're just taking the per student for general ed times the number of sped students, and that comes up in Section E with about $203 million in general education that's provided. Then Section F, you multiply that times the statewide average of LOB authorized. That was 31.57% in 2023. So that's that, in other words, that $203 million of regular general education funding resulted in another $64 million of LOB funding related to that. Then in Section G and H, it's just identifying the same things now. It's the federal aid, it's the Medicaid aid, the state hospital apportionment. You add all that together, and that totals $441 million. That's what's deducted from actual special education spending, which was roughly $1.1 billion. And the difference is excess costs of $667 million. The formula then goes on to deduct the special ed equalization, but you can't do that until you first calculate the LOB on the special education. So we would suggest that a couple of adjustments be made to House Bill 2738 so that you can actually do the math. We would have, and this also is in my table here on page 2 of my, page 3 of my testimony, where you see the whole, if you have it in front of you. Starting with what would be the new Section L, you would take excess costs times 92%. And that would result in about $614 million of excess costs at 92%. Then you divide excess costs by a factor of 1 plus the LOB percent. And this is, remember when we were in high school and some of us might have said, I'm never going to use this algebra. Well, it came in handy working on this. The reason it is 1 plus the LOB percent is shown in this box here. It is, if you look at it, special ed aid plus LOB equals 92% of excess costs. So it's 1 sped aid plus 0.3157 of sped aid equals 92%. You divide both sides by 1.357 then, and that results in the amount that is for the the LOB portion of special education. That is $147 million. Now, these are not, this is not counting special education LOB money more than once. These are 3 separate pieces of LOB funding. The first one was on general ed. This one is on the special ed weighting. And the next one is the supplemental aid. The Department of Education, you'll see on the first page of my testimony, they said that would have been $72.7 million for the equalization part, which worked out to 34.68%. So I made the math easy on me. I just estimated 35%. So $147 million times 35% would result in $51.5 million of LOB equalization. You add those 2 pieces of LOB together, that's $198.8 million. Deduct that from the total, and that leads to special education funding or weighting would have been $415 million. The proof is in adding those together. So $415 million plus $51 million of equalization plus $147 million of LOB off of SPED equals $613 million, which is the 92% of excess cost. So the math works. It balances that way. Now, I want to mention that the maintenance of effort in here is, it says it shall be no less than, because This math shows that it would, if this had been in place, it would have resulted in special ed aid of $415 million. That's not the intent of this bill, and so there is a maintenance of effort clause put in here that says regardless of the formula, it will not be less than $528 million. Last, I want to comment on the equalization part. As I understand it, last year we had, I think it was 135 districts receive more than 92% of their excess costs. And again, this is all KSDE data. So the way I envision this is that first 528 million gets distributed as is in statute now. If there was any more than 528 million, that money would first be used to give money to the districts that are below 92%. So those 135 that are above it wouldn't get anything more because they're already above 92. They wouldn't get more until the ones below 92% were brought up to that level. And if there was anything left after that, then KSDE could distribute that proportionally, however they choose to do it. But this looks like it's intended to be an equalization. And with that, I would be happy to stand for questions, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. Are there any other proponent testimony that we may have missed? All right, then we are opening for questions. Representative McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple. Mr. Schreiber, did you or your organization help draft this bill?
We have made our recommendations very well known on this, so I'm sure it certainly looks like our recommendations are part of this. We did not, I mean, I'm not a reviser. I do a lot of things. That's not one of the hats I wear, though.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Great, thank you. I worked really hard to prepare for this meeting yesterday, and as of last night, there were 90 opponents, and your proponent testimony did not appear until today at around 11 a.m. I was wondering, did you submit it late? Do you find it odd that 90 people felt moved to oppose this bill, and that at the last hour you on your testimony showed up?
I'm sorry, that's not accurate. Spencer, it actually did arrive on time. Spencer has only been working for me for, what, 2 weeks now? So you can respond if you'd like.
It appeared in my personal email, so I didn't get it uploaded till this morning. I apologize.
Thank you.
Representative Wynn.
Well, I likewise couldn't find, so do you have extra copies with you? I'd love to look at your charts and
I brought 20 copies and left them out on the table.
Oh, well, they're distributed. But just a little issue with your comment that unless the people know the history of the special task force, we barely had time to meet, let alone respond to your, I mean, the way you framed it, I'm not impugning any motives. So, you know, you and I have worked together before at this distance. But nevertheless, to say that, you know, we ignored you, am I correct to say, to interpret that you said the task force ignored your request to?
I said the task force ignored the suggestion that if they're going to recommend keeping the formula, that they identify some rational basis for excluding some of the weightings and some of the LOB. They did not. Once testimony was concluded, they went, there was no discussion of the formula. They went straight to recommendations.
And for those who are listening and those who know the background, we barely had a meeting. You understand that too. Well, if you don't understand it, I'm telling you now.
Well, Representative, I understand the timeline.
Yeah. But, and I don't discount what you say.
And there could have been, my point is, there could have been discussion at that point.
And there needs to be more discussion.
But there wasn't.
Correct. And so I guess my main point is to say, not knowing what you have suggested this today, I can't, without having read it before and preparing, I can't even kind of give you, many of us cannot give you the time that you need. So there's a lot of flaws in these processes, but I did have to comment on that because of the whole thing of the manner in which the task force actually was able to meet. So look forward to more discussion and more exchange of explanations, your explanation of your suggestions. So I do look forward to that.
I do too.
Thank you, bye.
And just a reminder to the committee that we did actually have another day that was dedicated to special education that was not the task force. I believe that was in October 10th or 11th. And then the year prior, we also had a day that was dedicated to special education. So we've been pretty diligent about spending time, not just in the task force, but prior, yeah.
But he was speaking specifically of one date. That's what I was.
Sure, not arguing, just wanting to make sure the committee knows of the time frame. Additional questions for Dave Traubert? Yes, Representative.
So if we adopt this bill, does any district end up with less than they currently receive?
Not as a result of the changes in this bill. I mean, districts could get less if they have lower expenditures. But the state would still, there is a maintenance of effort in place anyway. There's 528 million, or I think it was appropriated for the 23 year. If that 528 is still appropriated, nobody gets less unless they deserve less because of their own circumstances changing. But this formula does not result in anyone getting any less money than they would have otherwise.
Thank you. Do you think it's best for us to fund special education based on the teacher or based on the student?
I haven't had a chance to study enough information to have a just off the top of my head opinion on that. I would say, though, if your focus is on, if the legislature's obligation is based on a percentage of excess costs, then I'm not sure why we go through the math of allocating some to teachers, some to other things. If it's still going to come down to 92% of excess costs, then that might be the simpler way to do it. Whether you have the teachers or not, you're going to have the costs or not. So it's one of those, I wasn't around when that part of the formula was created, so I really can't comment on that. But it could be, I guess it could be done differently, but I don't have the rational basis for the reason it's done this way. Because the way it's done now, I mean, if you hear the testimony, and I think you saw it in a lot of the written testimony provided today, the focus is on schools not getting 92%. Well, the way this statute is written currently, a lot of districts get a lot more than 92%. I've seen a few get 150, 175%. If you look at it in a sort of a bizarre way, they're making money off of special education when they're getting more than 100%. I don't know that that was the intent, that some districts get more, but that's the way the current statute operates.
Thank you.
And just a note, when we had our interim, we had a review of other states, and it was either 5 or 6 states that do it like we do it, or similarly. The majority do it as you mentioned, by the student-weighted students, more difficult, and they tier them, but we are definitely a minority in states. This bill doesn't touch that. Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Trabert. When I look at the information that we've gotten from KSDE, it looks like in 2009-2010 school year, the total aid, which equaled 92% in a formula that's been through the legislative post-audit process multiple times, was $423,944,488,000. When you do a simple calculation for inflation, that would bring that dollar amount today to $609,459,846, which is closely in alignment with the governor's budget recommendation. So when we look at the fiscal note that the revisor gave to us, we see if we use the governor's recommendation versus what would happen in this bill, we would be $82 million short of simple inflation, and that doesn't even account for the increase in sped enrollment and services over that time. So you're a proponent of calculations that would leave us $83 million short of basic inflation?
That's not at all what I said, Representative.
Okay. That is what the fiscal note says.
No, if I may, the governor is recommending extra money. You can't simply increase special ed funding by inflation because there's a lot of other variables that can impact that. Enrollment could go up or down. Some students cost a little bit, some students cost a lot. Inflation isn't a factor that can be used when you have variables that can swing dramatically one way or the other. If it goes one way, inflation wouldn't begin to cover it because you're not looking at just the same things, just the cost of the same things increasing. That mix changes and can change dramatically over time. So no, all I'm recommending is that the legislature get credit for all of the sped funding that they provide, whether it's the weighting that's appropriated or all of the general education and other funding that is related to the special ed weighting.
Correct, but the dollar amount in 2009 would be $609 million today, not accounting for increases, and we've heard testimony over and over and over that the sped enrollment, the sped services, and the costs have certainly gone up. So
if you look at the history of sped enrollment, it's actually been rather flat. If you look at it's been around 28,000, 29,000 FTEs. And again, it's the cost that is a function. The statutory choice the legislature made was to reimburse a percentage of excess costs. So enrollment could be a factor, but what really matters is the excess cost, and you have to measure, if you look at how the costs have changed.
well,
And it would
the
also
KSDE
indicate.
data shows that the expenditures have increased by 44.5%.
Point of order, Madam Chairman. I believe we have rules that prohibit us from interrupting a conferee.
Thank you for your point of order. Did you conclude? And I will call on you if you'd like to ask an additional question.
In my opinion, you can't just apply inflation to a number that could, at any point between now and then, drop for very good reasons or increase significantly for very good reasons because of the cost of each student can vary dramatically. So just applying a factor, if I may, of inflation is one that is a convenience to say we need more money. The focus is on 92% of excess costs. So that's what we have to look at. And if you count all of the money that the legislature is providing, it works out to a lot more than 92%.
Representative Poskin, do you have any other questions?
I do not.
All right. Representative Nguyen, and any other questions, committee? All right.
Let me just follow up with what you just said. When the representative asked you, would any district lose money? Am I correct that you said essentially depending on the cost of services, it could go down? It could go up? We don't know, correct?
Well, a district wouldn't lose money unless it also lost cost.
Okay.
So a district would not be any worse off as a result of this formula.
But if the cost went, I think you gave the example that if the cost decreased, perhaps you wouldn't lose money?
Well, that's not losing money, though. You
Well,
would
the
get
cost
less
would
money. If the cost decreased,
We're on the same track.
yeah,
Your
if you're
cost
supposed
is
to get
determining your
92%,
services.
you know, if my cost goes down $10,000 next year, then
You
I
don't get
wouldn't get.
$10,000.
And that's not a result of this, but that's not a result of this formula.
I'm not questioning that.
And
I'm
my answer
saying-
was, you would not get any less as a result of this formula.
Okay. Now, using the same formula, if the cost increase, then the opposite could occur, correct?
They would get more, but that's not
No,
a
no, no.
result of this
They only get
formula.
more, and I'm not interrupting him. They would get more because the cost would increase, correct?
Regardless of this.
Exactly. So that we don't know, based on your first statement, it could go one direction or it could go the other direction.
No, I'd have to respectfully disagree, Representative. Again, this formula has no bearing on whether a district gets less money or more money.
I'm with you on
So
that.
no one loses money as a result of this legislation.
And I agree with, and I understand the words you're using. English is my first language, so I understand the words you're using. I'm saying, however, if the opposite happened, it could go the other direction, not based on the formula, just on the cost of services. Would you agree?
Costs are costs. They can go up or
Exactly.
down.
So-
Enrollment is, you know, some districts, well, I guess they don't get more money if they have more students the way the current formula works, but they eventually lose money if they lose students.
Exactly. So I'm saying your answer of what, yeah, don't interrupt me. So what I'm suggesting is I'm agreeing with you, but just as your answer went one direction, we don't know, it could go the other direction. Wouldn't you agree? First, we don't know what the cost is going to be tomorrow.
We don't know, but the costs that would be, the money that would be distributed would be done the same way.
Exactly.
And so if their costs went up, they would get more money.
Exactly.
But this legislation has no bearing. No one can say honestly that this legislation will cause us to lose money.
Exactly. So I'm saying, I agree with your statement, but it also, you cannot say for sure because we don't know the cost tomorrow.
No, ma'am, I can say absolutely for sure.
That-
Because this formula does not cause anyone to lose money.
Okay, but you don't know how the other factors you're talking about, how those would impact. I'm not talking about the formula. We're agreeing.
Then I'm not sure what you're talking about, Representative.
Well, that's understandable too. So
Okay, thank you. Kind of went a little circular, but I think at the end of the day, Representative Nguyen and Dave Traubert do agree that the formula that it's provided in this bill does not cause any district to lose money. Okay. Right. There are other variables outside of the formula, but this formula and this bill, they're in agreement, does not cause a district to lose money. All right. Okay, good job, committee. We're going to move on. Thank you, Dave. We are moving on to our next section. It's the opponent section. We do have 7 conferees. They will each receive 3 minutes, and that will give you over 21 minutes to go ahead and share. So we're going to start with Eric Davis, Superintendent, USD 337. Welcome. And if you look at Representative Getz, my vice chair, he'll kind of let you know. He'll just put his phone up and you can read it. And then I will probably give you a 10, 20-second leeway before I stop you. All right, welcome.
All right, my name is Eric Davis. I'm the superintendent at Royal Valley, just north of Topeka here. I serve Hoyt, Mayetta, and the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, so I'm a somewhat unique school district here in the state of Kansas. Just going to point out real fast, last year, 22-23, I received $1.2 million I had $1.2 million in special ed costs. I received $854,000 in federal and state aid, which left the district to transfer $376,875 out of my general fund and LOB to cover the gap between unfunded and unfunded special education aid. Now, this particular bill in front of you guys today is trying to take that gap and say, oh, well, we've been paying this all along because LOB state aid was never calculated in this. I don't know how everybody got this wrong for so long, but that is a problem. And then someone made the comment a little bit ago that no one's gonna lose money with this bill. I wanna point to line 13 of section 1 of the formula here, and I'm gonna point out that it asks every district to subtract off the portion attributable to special education state aid from their excess cost formula. And I'm going to point out this. Royal Valley is one of the poorest districts in the state in terms of assessed valuation per pupil. Okay, I'm going to be deducting off about $385,000 addition to what we've currently been doing for excess costs. I want to ask you what Olathe is going to have to subtract on line 13. They receive 0 state aid dollars in the LOB. They're going to subtract 0. That section 1 of this bill is inequitable. All right, where is the savings going to come from for saving all this money? It's going to come on the backs of the poorer school districts here in the state of Kansas. If you put section 1 into play, you're going to not have an equitable formula. Okay, Montoy, 2005, Gannon, all right? All these things were put into play, and this has already been tested once and said it had to be equitable. That's where the 92% came from, right? Okay, so the other piece about this is I'm kind of a unique school district, as I pointed out. I serve the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, and the Constitution protects educational sovereignty for tribes. And so we're both actually a standalone special ed district, and we are also a member of a cooperative. I'm not sure how to apply these formulas to my situation because I have both programs as part of the educational sovereignty for the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. So I'll need some clarification on that from the committee. Last piece is, I talked a lot about section 1. I really think the committee should totally abolish section 1 of this bill. The excess cost formula was never intended to be applied to an individual school district. The reason why, it's inequitable. You're gonna be back in a court case if you pass that because it is totally inequitable. This is all the savings will be on the back of the poor school districts, okay? The second thing is, in general, section 2, where we're talking about the total statewide funding, LOB was put in place with the intent for local school districts to be able to enhance their school programming and do things uniquely, right? And so this goes against that. This is forcing us to spend dollars that are already going to enhance our program, and we're not allowed to do that.
All right, thank you. You are right on time. Next, we have Jamie Morris Hardman, President of the School Board of USD 383. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Committee, for letting me come speak with you today. In addition to serving as the president of the USD 383 Board of Education for Manhattan-Ogden, I've been a CASA volunteer for 25 years. I've been an education advocate for the state, and I have 2 kids who have received special ed services. So this is obviously an area where I feel quite a bit of passion. Within our district itself, I can't speak to other districts, but last year we transferred $3.4 million from general fund and LOB into special ed excess. That's money that could be used right now to benefit every student in our district. I think that it's very important that we provide special education services to our children at the level that is required by the feds and that is best for those children. But that being said, that's taking money away from the general ed classroom. We have class sizes that are probably too large right now to really provide students with the services that they need to be able to be competitive when you think about their long-term education. They can't get the interventions that they need. We have a huge issue with staff retention in Manhattan-Ogden because of the pay that we have for classified staff, particularly paraeducators. That could be remedied with more funding coming in for special education. But when you think about $3.4 million for a district with 6,500 students, that's pretty significant. And that's a lot of money in a classroom that makes a huge difference. To me, public education is one of the biggest workforce development and economic development funds that we have in the state. When we think about the long-term health of the state of Kansas, the money that goes into public education impacts that in a way that no other money impacts our state. And I think that if we could put more of that money toward special education from the state to help us have funds available in the general fund to allow us to provide the best quality education possible for our students, that really benefits everybody. So I want to thank you for your consideration. Thank you for your time that you spend on public education in this committee. We are all very grateful for that. and thank you for letting me be heard.
Thank you, Jamie. Next, we have April Hilliard from Butler Counter. I think that's supposed to be Counties Special Education Interlocal, or is that Counter?
It's county.
Okay, 638.
Thank you for letting me be here. I'm the director of Butler County Interlocal. We serve 9 districts in Butler County who enroll a total of 1,700 students, serving 3,400 students throughout the school year, both IDEA students and students with giftedness. In Butler County Interlocal, our school districts transfer $6.3 million from their general funds to Butler County Interlocal to support special education needs. These are dollars that could be used in their general expenditures to support students. Instead, they're supporting our students. Yes, we do have to support students based on IDEA. It's federal law, so we don't have a choice. But what I could tell you is if we were fully funded in special education, we would do things with that money that could support not only our students, but our staff. Our staff are the ones that carry the burden of the underfunding. They're the ones that have to have excessive caseloads. They're the ones that have to work without enough paraeducators because we do not pay them an equitable wage. And just for an example, in Butler County Interlocal last year, we raised our para wages to $11.30 an hour for a base. $11.30. That $1 raise cost us $498,000 because we have 400 paras. That money came from our districts, not from special education. And so to say that this is not an appropriations bill, that's fine. But what it means is it's less money for us and less money for our districts, and we have to make really tough choices, not about serving kids, because we will continue to do that, but what the people who carry that burden are our staff. Our general ed staff carry the burden because there's no additional funds left for raises. Our special education staff carry the burden because there's no additional fund left for raises. And every dollar has to go to making sure either special education services are provided or the bare minimum at the district level because there's not enough to be provided. And so when I look at my testimony, I really want to make sure that you understand that by changing the formula, you're saying that you do not have an obligation to fund the 92% because the formula would make it look like you already do. The only thing it's doing is moving pot money from one pot to another pot, and that's it. There is no additional money for districts anywhere else. The formula is already flawed because it's not supposed to be applied at a district level. And I can say, when you start talking about federal funds, for example, the question's been asked many times, how does the interlocal receive federal funds? They come straight to us. They do not flow through to our districts, and that's not even accounted for in the information that you received on excess cost. And the other thing I can tell you, there is no district in Kansas making money on special education. In Butler County Interlocal, 27% of my revenue comes from district assessments. 27%. Nobody's making money. Thank you.
Thank you, April. Next, we have Jim Carlskent, USA Kansas.
Good afternoon, committee and Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I am Jim Carlskent. I'm with United School Administrators of Kansas. You know, we've heard a lot of words today, but I think we're playing word games. This bill will take money away from school districts. I don't care what you say. It's going to take money away from school districts. You know, I've shared with you before, I'm a former legislator. I served on the K-12 Education Budget Committee back in 17 and 18. Representative Wynn is the only one on this committee that was on that at the time. But when we were working on trying to satisfy the Gannon case, the attorneys kept telling us, show your work, show your work. And we did. We got tired of hearing it, and we did show our work. We showed our work on information within this bill right here. You know, and the sad part of it is, this bill is a disaster looking for a lawsuit. You know, and it's ironic that the Supreme Court released, you know, Gannon here a week or so ago, and now this bill appears. Folks, we're going back to court, you know, and we don't need to go through that. The legislature doesn't, the state doesn't. Let's get serious about really funding special education. You know, I don't want to take a lot of your time. We spent a lot of time on this formula today. but it is flawed. I think most of you know that. So I'll close for now and allow you to ask questions for the people that have already testified. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Next, we have Leah Fleiter, KASB.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today in opposition. I would like to reiterate what a couple of our just recent opponents just said. We need to set the record straight. There are no school districts in Kansas receiving more special education funding than they are spending. KSDE can confirm that. And again, that 92% is a statewide figure. It is not 92% for each district, okay? So please ask KSD to explain that. Okay. In 2023, the state legislature passed a law directing that a task force meet and develop recommendations on special education funding and services. The text of the law indicates the task force was supposed to meet more than once. I know we've plowed this ground in this committee before. The task force met only once for 3 hours on January 5th. It made some recommendations that now, unfortunately, appeared to be ignored. And then within just a few days of its only meeting, a bill was introduced in this committee to eliminate the task force. So unfortunately, this bill appears to us to be an attempt to circumvent the legislature's own law, directing a thorough and thoughtful study of the important issue of funding and delivery of special education services in our state. Instead, it appears to merely manipulate the existing general education school finance formula to give the appearance that the state is indeed fully funding education. House Bill 2738 doesn't change the fact that Kansas school boards continue to be forced to backfill from their general funds to ensure that Kansas children receive the special education services they are legally and morally entitled to receive. As a result, this legislative failure to fully fund special education deprives general education students of the high-quality, equitable, public school education that is directed by the state constitution and that their taxpayer parents rightfully expect. KSB wants public schools where every Kansas student develops the skills, knowledge, and training they need to prepare them for success. Unfortunately, this bill would prevent our students from achieving these goals. We ask the committee to reject the bill and commit instead to a sincere and thorough examination of special education funding by the Special Education Task Force while upholding current law in the interim. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Leah. Next, we have Judith Dede. She is on WebEx Game on Kansas. Judith, you have 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify in opposition to HB 2738. We hope you will listen to the school administrators, school board members, and special education experts on the specific flaws of the formula in this bill. As parents and community members, we add the following objections. Any attempts to create a new special education formula should be vetted by the Special Education Task Force or a working group of that task force. The funding and provision of special education are complex, and we believe the already existing Special Education Task Force or a working group established by that task force would be better equipped to handle the evaluation of these issues than a legislative committee. When the bill to create the task force was debated on the House floor, we were told that it would make recommendations on changes to the formula, conduct hearings, and listen to anyone throughout the state. The task force was only able to have one half-day meeting, but the majority voted to continue meeting either as a task force or as a working group. HB 2738 disregards both the process and the expertise of the Special Education Task Force. People are saying this bill doesn't affect appropriations, but it seems to be justifying continued underfunding of special education. We emphasize the importance of funding for the special education and the general education population. Additionally, LOB funding is for extras and not for essential special education services, and to the extent it is used for special education, it should be counted as local funding and not state funding. LOB was never meant to be mandated for use as SPED funding, let alone be counted as a state's share. Additionally, local districts are already responsible for 8% of excess costs. If we are to force spending LOB funds on SPED, they must count towards the local share, not the state share. We also note that at-risk funding doesn't have a state and local split as special education funding does. Thank you for the consideration of these and other issues relating to House Bill 2738. We urge you to oppose this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Mary Sinclair, Kansas PTA. She is also on WebEx. Mary, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. On behalf of the Kansas PTA, thank you for the opportunity as well to provide testimony in opposition to this bill. This stands in conflict with our member-driven standing positions and legislative priorities. The premise of this alternate calculation runs contrary to decades of Kansas legislative post-audits and cost studies in which educational and school finance experts repeatedly confirmed the general soundness of these formulas, including the Consensus Revenue Estimate Group, Legislative Research Department, Legislative Post-Audit, the Governor's Office, Department of Education, State Board of Education, Kansas Association of School Boards, the Kansas National Education Associations, and United School Administrators of Kansas. So I'm just going to pull a quote from one of the 2018 legislative post-audit studies. Special education funding has been correctly calculated and distributed in the years reviewed, but the legislature has provided less funding than required by state law. The Kansas PTA supports the recommendations of the legislatively appointed Special Education Task Force. This task force in January recommended fully funding the excess cost of special education services at 92%. It's currently reflected in state law. The members of this task force include a majority of individuals currently working in and leading our public schools. And these experts affirmed that districts are transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars collectively from their general operating budgets to cover these excess costs, which is eroding the restoration of the state aid for general education under the Gannon Agreement. The members of this current task force also agreed to continue meeting to address any outstanding questions or concerns regarding the special education funding formula. I think this point was just made about the use of local option budget for state aid. And I just wanted to note that the reclassification of funding for public education is not new in Kansas. During the 10 years of the Gannon lawsuit, the Kansas legislature changed statutory language to count the mandatory 20 mil levy as state aid from what had historically been attributed as local aid. The change in calculation instantly generated another $500 million in state aid, but without changing the overall allocation of dollars to meet adequacy. And today, I think that 20 mils generates $800 million in local property taxes that gets counted towards state aid, but I'm getting off task. I think the point I wanted to make is the Kansas Supreme Court has already addressed this exercise in reclassification of funding. The Supreme Court held that total spending is not the touchstone of adequacy. The courts reiterated that the legislature should focus instead on creating a public education financing system for grades 12, K through 12, that through structure and implementation is reasonably calculated to have all Kansas public education students meet or exceed the standards set out in Rose. To that point, the Kansas PTA supports the premise that the local option budget was and intended to provide programs and services that are separate from state requirements and not to backfill gaps in the state's obligation to fund schools to the level of actual costs to provide every child with the opportunity to meet the state education goals. I would close with a reminder that all students are general education students first. This is a critical value and a right that is reflected in the current school funding formulas. We urge members of this committee to vote no on this bill if it's worked, and thank you very much for your consideration.
All right, thank you. Committee, we do not have any other opponent testimony unless we missed opponent testimony, and we do not have neutral testimony. So I'll now open up time for questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Representative Estes, please say who you would like to address with your question.
My question is for Leah, and it's something that several different people have mentioned and something we've talked about. I hear that, this formula is not meant to be applied on a district-by-district basis. But when I do look at what happens when it is applied that way, I have a really difficult time reconciling, is it broken? Are we doing it in the best interest? And I think we're asking multiple questions, but when we get to that one question, are we getting it out to districts correctly? Because when I look at that chart, one of my districts that has expensive students to help is getting around 60%. And that's the basis for my question. Do we have room to improve how we distribute the money?
First of all, I would respectfully say that if the law is fully funded, then districts are receiving the amount that they need. I'm sorry to say and to keep pushing back that applying that 92%, and you have a district that is, getting 60, and my district is getting 112, that's just a false calculation. The 92% calculation is supposed to be, we calculate what 92% of the excess cost is to provide special education to all of the students with IEPs in the state. That's the 92%. The law does not say each district will be reimbursed for 92% of its excess costs. And so, yes, it is very confusing because when you unfortunately apply that very confusing spreadsheet that I think we all are gnashing our teeth about, that I think we first saw, was it like a year ago or more? I think there was some context that was on a cover sheet or a memo for that original spreadsheet that Dr. Nuenswander shared a long time ago that kind of started all of this. And I think with that context, I think he was trying to demonstrate something. I'm not sure why that information was presented in that way. No disrespect to Dr. Nuenswander, who is very happily retired now. But the law says 92% is how we figure the excess cost that the legislature is responsible for appropriating. It is not that, Wichita gets 92% of its costs, Manhattan gets 92% of its costs. So it's just, I'm sorry to say, it's just a false calculation and a false message. And I know you all have been very confused by this.
Madam Chair, may I have a follow-up? And I hear what you're saying, but it makes me wonder if the premise of 92% for the state is wrong, because I don't have a comfort level that we're getting the right amounts to the districts. Okay. So I'm not asking if we fund the 92%, but is there room for a conversation that we may not be giving it back out the right way?
No, I think districts would support that conversation within the context of a special education task force that meets several times, that is, comprised of people who work in the field. The one that met once did have some people who had a pretty broad range of expertise, all the way from Tiny K to, Olathe, the second biggest district in the state, and kind of everything in between. I know that our districts would be more than willing to see the conversation take place, but in a measured way by a task force of knowledgeable practitioners. I acknowledge that many of you on this committee have an education background of some form, including yourself. But none of us can claim to be special education experts unless we are, Ms. Hilliard or, the Tiny K person whose name is escaping me, So there is certainly room for a conversation. But unfortunately, this bill and one or two committee hearings is not the place, respectfully.
All right, thank you. Leah, we're not confused. All right, Representative Hill and then Representative Schmoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess this question is kind of addressed to all conferees that this applies to. I heard a number of conferees say that it would take money, this bill would take money away from districts. And I'm looking at this. This is not an appropriations bill. Where does that money go to that's taken away from districts?
You have to look at it from a, sorry, Representative Hill, thank you. I think you have to look at it from what the future is going to bring. So the $576 million is going to stay put, and at Royal Valley, I'll continue to get my portion based off of how many teachers or how many pairs I have, right? So that part might go up or down a little bit, but the piece that I'm struggling with this bill is the section 1, where then you're, after that $576 million, you're going to start appropriating it based off of this maintenance, excess cost formula that is inequitable to a small school district, a small poor school district. And so it may not be so much that dollars are going to go backwards. They could if I reduce teachers or paras, but I'm not going to get any more money for a long time because you're going to make me subtract an extra $385,000 off because of that LOB state aid that you're now including. And that only applies, and it gets bigger. The more poor your school district is, the bigger that subtraction in line 13 gets. And that's where it becomes inequitable. Does that answer your question?
If I'm understanding you right, you're revising your statement to say that it would not take money away from your district, but you don't trust the legislature in the future to continue appropriating money.
I'm saying any money beyond $576 million, the formula that was explained in section 1 would not allow my district to qualify for some time because of the excess cost extra calculation going towards my district.
What currently is your excess cost in your district?
It's not a district calculation. I couldn't answer that for you.
You know, just a quick statement on that, because I have a lot of districts that come to me and talk about how much they're having to take from general fund money. And apparently they calculate it on a district by district basis. They aren't talking to me about what the state level is. They talk, and I believe you mentioned something about that too.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that an excess cost calculation. That's just the gap between what I receive in current state aid for special education and the actual cost. It was $376,000.
And what percentage of your special ed expenditures was that?
So out of 1,231,000, I don't know but you could do the math, I guess, on a calculator, right? So
it sounds like you're saying you get about 75%.
yeah, probably around there.
Okay, I think that's pretty easy to calculate.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And before you go, Representative Schmoy, I will say, Aaron, that Eric, okay, apologize. Yeah, Eric, sorry. Eric, LOB is equalized, so the state does equalize. So if you are a more lower income, if you will, per pupil, average pupil, you would get more. So I don't know if you knew that. But also, when you talk about the additional money that the bill specifies, additional monies over the $528 million, it says that the state board shall give consideration to the discrepancies between each school district. It doesn't require a certain amount. It says shall give consideration. So it would be up to them. And it says, with the purpose of such special education services, aid equalization distribution schedule shall be to provide for a more equitable. How they interpreted more equitable is not defined. So just so you know.
Yeah, I understood that portion of the bill. Spencer defined it a little bit differently when he got up here, explained it at the beginning, in my opinion.
Spencer?
So, Nick, sorry.
We're all having trouble with names today.
Nick did explain that a little bit differently, I felt like, when he was up here talking at the beginning, but I understand that. But I also, as a comment, I think you're giving the State Department of Education an impossible task to use that excess cost formula as the metric to try and distribute those additional funds beyond the $576 million.
All right, Representative Schmoy, you can go ahead and have a seat, sir. And Representative, please direct who you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'll probably ask it of you. So as
I didn't know I was a conferee, but
no, I think that you have the information that I need. As a former para that's absolutely loved the job and loved the opportunity and could not afford life
on a para salary. I absolutely agree that special education is drastically in need of funding. We do meet the 92% as far as state level currently. What is the dollar amount that the federal is behind right now?
Over 300 million annually.
Okay.
If they were to reach their high watermark goal of 40%, which was originally their goal.
Okay. That being said, I'm a little concerned that we're kind of field of dreams in this. Basically coming to the state and saying, well, if we spend it, they will fund. And so I'm just kind of wondering, I understand that we only have control over our own funding at the state level that we are currently funding at the 92%. What have the opponents heard from federal level as far as their obligation? Do we have any idea on that?
Leah.
Thank you for the question. Appreciate that. Every year, the Kansas Association of School Boards sends a delegation to Washington, D.C. at the end of January, and there are school board members from across the state who attend. And I'm kind of the staffer. I wrangle all of the board members, okay? So Dr. Nguyen was one of the board members who attended this year. We met with each of the 6 congressional offices. We had the good fortune to meet with a couple of people in person, Senator Moran and Representative Tracy Mann, and had a very good meeting with Representative Ron Estes' staffer, who has been with him since the beginning and is very experienced and very knowledgeable on the issue. They all told us they support fully funding IDEA. The challenge is getting there. You know, there are a couple of bills that we asked them to support in Congress that would phase it in over 10 years. So roughly, let's say $30 billion a year, which of course that's a lot of money, you know, and that's acknowledged. So we have been told, yeah, you know, that's certainly a great goal. It unfortunately it might take longer than that. What we tend to have heard over the past handful of years is, we support you. There are a lot of other spending that we have to also address. And so what the impression that we received and the message that we received is, you know, probably about a 1% increase from the federal government this year. So thank you for the question, because I had meant to address that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That might take us up to what, 13, 14%?
Madam Chair, could I just add to that? Is that okay?
Who's speaking?
This is Mary Sinclair with the Kansas PTA.
Briefly, but this isn't a roundtable, so it's typically a question and answer, but go ahead.
Oh, I misunderstood. I thought the conferees who were asked. I just wanted to mention that Kansas PTA also is active in asking our U.S. representatives to fully fund special education. So the National PTA organization pulls delegates from across each state to lobby for full funding, well, not lobby, but to advocate for full funding for special education. I just wanted to share that as well.
Thank you for doing that. We'll just have a couple more questions. Representative McDonald.
I think my question might be best answered by like KSDE, maybe Dr. Harwood. Would that be appropriate?
Not a conferee, but if you don't mind, Frank, you're welcome to come up.
Okay. So I'm a little skeptical of Mr. Trabert's math. Can you give me your impression of his math? Is it accurate? Where did he get it wrong? Help us understand that.
So I can't say that I worked with the exact same numbers because I've not seen his chart. But in looking at the same math, we came up with a number of about $400 million of what would be considered 92% of the excess costs with the new calculation. Some of the things that are different than in counting the extra the additional weightings in the first part. One of the reasons that I think that those were not included in the future actually goes back to Representative Williams' comment of we were looking for the average cost of general education. All of those weightings are something that are kind of beyond average. At risk is students that need something beyond the average services. CTE is something that districts are offering beyond the average programs for those things. So I think there's a rational explanation for why those were not included in the past. I think Mr. Trabert was correct in his assertion that the first time that LOB is taken out is very similar to the way it was before. It's just taken out at a different time. And that would be the LOB that is associated with the special education students that are attending the districts with the weightings that are counted. I think the difference comes in with the other LOB weightings. One of them is the portion of the LOB that is attributed to special education state aid being calculated as part of the general fund. And that's the only time that it's done that way. And so then you take out the equalization, which has been talked about, which is about 41%. So that part is taken out. The third one is probably the one that is hardest for me to understand, in that you apply the statewide LOB to the special education costs. And so I have a harder time understanding how that is done, and especially when it's the entire LOB attributed, which 60% of that would be be raised with most local mill levies. So I would agree with, I think his numbers were reasonable for the calculation. I think we used some slightly different numbers, but came up to a similar calculation. And went basically from using for 24 that the state was funding about 67% of excess costs to about 110% of excess costs.
And final question, it looks like, yeah, Representative Ousley.
Madam Chair, it's not a question other than just could you restate could you restate what you said you figured the 92% finances to be?
So when we did our calculations with what would have been the calculation for FY24 using the new formula, and this is just section 2, we did not look at section 1, though it's the same calculation. The appropriation that you come up with, the appropriation for this year, as opposed to funding 67% of excess costs, would fund 110% of excess costs. And not by adding any more money, just by taking credit, for taking more things out of the excess cost calculation.
And did you say what state aid dollar amount would be equivalent to 92% according to the reclassification or recalculation of this House bill? I thought I caught that, and that was all I was asking.
It's right around it's similar, it's between $400 and $450 million, I think, is what would be required for 92% of the new calculation.
Thank you, sir. And Madam Chair, I hope that wasn't the last question, because I just wanted clarification. Thank you.
I do believe it is the last question. We tried to get out of here at 5 o'clock, and I did push it past 5. It's 5:10. If someone is really wanting to ask another question, we could take one more. But if not, I am going to go ahead and close the hearing on House Bill 2738. Thank you to all our conferees. Let's see. So again, on Monday, we are going to be looking at our budget again. And so KSDE is going to be providing a little bit more information. And KSDE, if you could please also provide us the list of federal dollars that KSDE's received since the legislature adjourned in 2023, and what those monies were used for or are going to be used for, or what the federal government gave those funds for. So if you could provide that on Monday. We also have a bill hearing, and what else am I missing, Jennifer? Seems like there's something else. And possible action on Tuesday of previously heard bills. So with that, committee,